Blood under fingernails never really washes out. Riley learned that in Fallujah, but it applied just as well to the sticky linoleum of Mercy General. She was scraping dried bile off her shoe when the chief surgeon called her useless. 10 minutes later, the Blackhawks rattled the glass. Fluorescent lights in Trauma Bay 3 emitted a high-pitched, mosquito-like whine that no one else seemed to notice. Riley Mercer noticed it. She noticed the way it pulsed just a fraction of a second out of rhythm with the heart monitor. She noticed the smell of the room, too, a sharp metallic cocktail of iron betadine and the stale sweat of panicked paramedics. Mostly, though, she noticed the way Dr. Harrison Gable's jaw clenched right before he made a bad call. Pacing. Gable snapped, holding out a gloved hand without looking up. "And get me another line. This guy's tanking." Riley didn't move toward the IV kits. She stood at the foot of the gurney, her cheap hospital-issue scrubs stiff with starch and someone else's dried blood. Her back ached. A dull, throbbing knot sat right between her shoulder blades, the souvenir of 12 hours on her feet. The patient, a mid-40s. John Doe, pulled from a crushed sedan on Interstate 5, was drowning in his own chest cavity. His skin was the color of old cement. The monitor screamed a frantic, irregular rhythm. I said another line. Gable barked, his voice cracking slightly. He was a brilliant man in a sterile, perfectly lit operating theater. Down here in the mud of the ER, when the blood was still warm and pooling on the floor, he was a tightly wound spring of pure anxiety. His custom monogrammed scrubs were spotless. He guarded them against the splatter like a cat avoiding rain. "Doctor," Riley said, her voice entirely flat. "Look at his neck." Gable finally snapped his head up, his eyes wide and furious above his mask. "Excuse me, are you deaf or just incompetent? I need access. Trachea is deviating to the left," Riley said, ignoring the insult. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Jugular veins are distended. Breath sounds on the right are absent. He doesn't need fluids. He has a tension pneumothorax. If you pump him full of saline, you'll stop his heart. Silence hung in the trauma bay, thick and heavy, broken only by the frantic beeping of the monitor. The two junior residents froze. The respiratory therapist stopped bagging the patient for a fraction of a second. Gable stared at her. Riley stared back. Her eyes were dull-rimmed with purple exhaustion, holding precisely zero respect for the man across from her. She had seen 18-year-old medics patch blown-off limbs in the pitch dark under mortar fire with steadier hands than Gable currently possessed. Gable swallowed hard. He looked down at the patient's neck. The bulge of the shifted windpipe was obvious now that she had pointed it out. A flush of hot, furious red crept up Gable's neck. He snatched a 14-gauge needle off the tray, the one Riley had quietly unspooled and laid out 2 minutes ago, anticipating this exact crisis. He slammed it into the patient's second intercostal space. A loud, wet hiss of escaping air filled the room. The monitor's frantic screaming immediately geared down into a steady, rhythmic beep. The patient's color stopped degrading. "Chest tube," Gable muttered, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the patient's ribs. "Prep him for surgery. Move." Riley nodded once, stepping back to let the surgical transport team swarm the bed. She didn't wait for a thank you. You didn't get thanked for saving a doctor from his own ego. You just got a target on your back. 20 minutes later, the trauma bay was empty, smelling of bleach wipes and lingering copper. Riley was scrubbing down the equipment trays, her knuckles raw and dry from cheap antibacterial soap. Footsteps squeaked against the freshly mopped floor outside the open door. Gable's voice drifted in low and sharp. He was talking to Brenda, the night shift charge nurse. "I don't care what the staffing agency told you," Gable was saying. "I want her off my floor. Dr. Gable Riley is highly qualified." Brenda started, her voice tired. "She is a liability. She's insubordinate." She hesitated during a critical resuscitation to give me a lecture. Gable's shadow stretched across the floor into the bay. I am not having my license put at risk by someone who doesn't even have a permanent locker here. She's just a temp, a warm body to fill a shift. Replace her by tomorrow night, or I'm going to administration. Riley tossed the bleach wipe into the red biohazard bin. It made a soft, hollow thud. She didn't feel angry. She didn't feel vindicated. She just felt exhausted. She leaned her weight against the stainless steel sink, closing her eyes. She liked being a temp. She liked being invisible. When you were a temp, nobody asked about the gap in your resume. Nobody asked why a nurse with her clinical skills was working the graveyard shift at an underfunded county hospital. Nobody asked what she was doing in the mountains of the Hindu Kush 3 years ago, or why she woke up sweating, reaching for a sidearm that was no longer there. Just a temp, Riley whispered to the empty room. She rubbed her dry eyes with the heels of her hands. Yeah, let's keep it that way. The break room smelled heavily of burnt popcorn and despair. Riley sat in the corner booth, staring at the plastic wrapper of a vending machine honey bun that had expired 3 days ago. She didn't want to eat it. She just needed her hands to have something to hold on to. Her fingers were trembling. It was a faint, nearly imperceptible vibration, but she felt it. Adrenaline always demanded a toll. Down in the bay she had been ice. Now the delayed chemical dump was coursing through her veins, making her teeth ache. She took a slow, deep breath, holding it in her chest for 4 seconds, exhaling for 4. A grounding technique. You're in Seattle, she told herself. It's raining. You smell stale coffee, not cordite. You're fine. The trembling didn't stop. In fact, it seemed to be getting worse. The water in the plastic cup on the table began to ripple. Riley frowned. She looked at her hands. They were perfectly still now. The vibration wasn't in her body. It was in the floor. A low, heavy thrum resonated through the concrete foundation of the hospital. It was a deep, guttural bass that vibrated right in the center of her sternum. The loose ceiling tile above the refrigerator began to rattle against its metal track. Clack, clack, clack. Riley's stomach dropped. The cold, logical part of her brain instantly categorized the sound. It wasn't the hospital's Eurocopter EC-135 life flight. The life flight sounded like a sewing machine, high, thin whining. This sound was massive. It was the heavy twin-turbine roar of military hardware. It was the sound of millions of dollars of matte black machinery aggressively displacing air. And there were 2 of them. Outside the frosted window of the break room, the sodium streetlights flickered. The roar grew deafening, drowning out the hum of the vending machine, shaking the dust off the top of the cabinets. The distinct concussive wub-wub-wub of rotor wash began throwing gravel and debris against the exterior glass. Riley stood up slowly. The honey bun fell to the floor. She walked to the window and wiped a circle in the condensation, landing directly on the ambulance ramp, ignoring the designated helipad on the roof, ignoring the painted lines, ignoring all FAA and civilian hospital protocols, were 2 MH-60M Black Hawks. They were completely blacked out. No running lights, no tail numbers, just dark, predatory shapes settling onto the concrete, their rotors whipping the heavy Seattle rain into a localized hurricane. No, Riley whispered. She took a step back, her chest suddenly tight. No, I'm dead. I'm off the roster. Out in the hallway, chaos erupted. Brenda's voice came over the intercom, shrill and panicked. Security to the ambulance bay, security to the ambulance bay. We have an unauthorized landing. Riley stepped out of the break room. The emergency department was in a state of bewildered paralysis. Nurses, orderlies, and patients on gurneys were all staring toward the sliding glass automatic doors of the ambulance bay. Dr. Gable was marching down the center of the hallway, his face purple with outrage. "What in God's name is going on?" he shouted, grabbing a security guard by the shoulder. "Tell Life Flight they can't land 2 birds at the doors. We have incoming ambulances." "That's not Life Flight, Doc." the guard yelled over the deafening roar of the idling engines outside. The automatic glass doors slid open. The wind immediately howled into the pristine hospital hallway, bringing with it the harsh, choking smell of JP-8 aviation fuel and wet asphalt. 4 figures stepped through the doors. They weren't paramedics. They were massive, clad in mud-splattered tactical gear plate carriers and drop-leg holsters. They wore night vision mounts on high-cut helmets. Their boots left thick, dark clumps of earth on the polished linoleum. They carried themselves with an aggressive, relaxed lethality that made the entire hospital staff instinctively take a step backward. Gable, blinded by his own sense of authority, stepped directly into their path. "Stop right there!" Gable bellowed, pointing a finger at the lead man. "This is a sterile environment. You are armed and you are tracking mud into my trauma center. Who is your commanding officer? I am having you arrested." The lead operator didn't even break his stride. He was a mountain of a man with a thick, rain-soaked beard and cold, grey eyes. He simply reached out a gloved hand, placed it flat on Gable's chest, and shoved him aside. Gable stumbled backward, slamming his shoulder hard into a rolling vitals cart. It tipped over with a crash, the blood pressure cuff tangling around his legs. "Hey!" he sputtered, humiliated and shocked. "Security, remove these men." The security guard took one look at the heavily armed operators and made the incredibly wise decision to pretend he suddenly had a problem with his radio. The operators ignored the screaming doctor. They ignored the panicked nurses. Their eyes scanned the hallway, cold and efficient, cutting through the crowd. Riley was standing perfectly still near the nurses' station. She had crossed her arms over her chest, digging her nails into her own biceps. She wanted to run. She wanted to slip out the fire exit and disappear into the rain. But she knew you didn't run from these men. They hunted people for a living. The lead operator's eyes locked onto her. He stopped. The 3 men behind him instantly stopped, forming a loose, protective diamond formation around him. The silence in the hallway was profound, broken only by the muffled roar of the choppers outside and the heavy, rhythmic thud of the operator's boots as he walked straight toward Riley. He stopped 2 feet away from her. He looked at her stained scrubs, the dark circles under her eyes, and the cheap plastic ID badge clipped to her collar that simply read, "Riley M. Temp RN." A slow, wry smile cracked the dirt and camo paint on his face. "You look like hell, boss," he said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that carried down the quiet hall. Riley closed her eyes for a brief second. Her shoulders slumped. "I told you never to find me, Hayes." "Yeah, well," Hayes said, shifting his rifle slightly. "The feeling's mutual, but we got a bird idling out there and a Tier 1 asset bleeding out in the back. Shot through the neck field, track failed. Nobody else can fix it. Take him to Walter Reed." Riley said, her voice turning hard. She didn't look at the other nurses. She didn't look at Gable, who had finally untangled himself from the cart and was staring at her with wide, uncomprehending eyes. "I'm retired. I gave my blood. I'm a civilian. Asset's name is Miller," Hayes said quietly. Riley's breath hitched. The air left her lungs like she'd been punched. Miller. The kid. The one who had carried her out of the Helmand Province wreckage. Hayes reached into his tactical vest, pulled out a thick, Velcro-backed patch, and slapped it hard against the center of Riley's chest. She caught it out of reflex. It was a heavily worn medical cross-colored, subdued black and gray. "You got 2 minutes to get your gear." "Captain." Hayes said, his tone shifting from friendly to absolute authority. "Or I'm throwing you over my shoulder and carrying you onto that bird as you are." Gable pushed his way through the frozen crowd of nurses, his face a mask of utter bewilderment. "Captain," he stammered, looking from the giant armed men to the temp nurse he had just fired. "What is this? Who are you people? She's just a temp." Hayes slowly turned his head to look at Gable. The operator's eyes held zero humanity. It was the look of a man evaluating a piece of furniture that was in his way. "Doc," Hayes said softly. If you speak to her again, I'm going to wire your jaw shut. Hayes turned back to Riley. Tick-tock Mercer. Miller's drowning. Riley looked down at the patch in her hand. The edges were frayed. It smelled like dust and dried blood. Her blood. Her past. She looked up past Hayes, past the gaping faces of her co-workers, past the arrogant chief surgeon who had called her useless. She looked at the blacked-out helicopters waiting in the rain. Tell the pilots to spin up. Riley said, her voice dropping the tired, cynical drawl. It was suddenly sharp, commanding. It was a voice that belonged in a war zone. And get me a surgical kit. A real one. Rain hit her face like cold, driving nails the moment she crossed the threshold of the automatic doors. There was no heroic slow-motion strut to the waiting helicopters. Riley slipped on a patch of wet oil slicked across the ambulance bay, her cheap rubber clogs completely devoid of traction. She barked her shin violently against a concrete bollard. She cursed a harsh, ugly sound lost instantly to the deafening concussive thud of the rotors. Hayes grabbed the back of her scrub top, hauling her upright like a toddler. The fabric tore with a pathetic rip. She didn't care. The downwash from the twin Black Hawks was a physical wall stealing the oxygen from her lungs and whipping her loose hair into her eyes. Inside the cabin of the lead bird, the noise shifted from a roar to a localized earthquake. The crew chief didn't offer a hand. He grabbed her by the webbing of her belt and dragged her onto the grated aluminum deck. The cabin was bathed in angry, washed-out red tactical lighting. It smelled like an abattoir. The sharp, toxic tang of JP-8 aviation fuel mixed sickeningly with the heavy, sweet reek of raw iron, voided bowels, and old sweat. Riley dropped to her knees. The deck was an ice rink. A thick slurry of blood and rainwater coated the diamond plate floor, soaking instantly through the thin cotton of her pants. Miller lay pinned to the floor by the sheer gravity of his own dying. He was 23 years old, maybe 24 now. He looked like a wax figure left out in the sun. His skin was translucent under the crimson bulbs, his lips pulled back over his teeth in a rictus of autonomic panic. His chest wasn't rising. Straddling him was a medic Riley vaguely recognized, a kid named Coop, his face pale and slick with terror. Coop had both of his thumbs buried deep into the side of Miller's neck, his forearms shaking violently with the effort of holding pressure. Dark, syrupy blood was welling up between Coop's knuckles, spilling in hot pulses down Miller's collarbone. What happened? Riley screamed. Her voice felt like razor blades in her throat, barely carrying over the whine of the turbines, spooling up for takeoff. Took a ricochet under the jawline. Coop yelled back, his eyes wide, fixed on Riley like she was a god descending from the clouds. Missed the carotid venous bleeder, but it shattered the cricoid cartilage. I tried to bag him, but his airway is a mess. I tried to drop a tube, but it just filled with blood. He's drowning, Captain. The helicopter lurched violently. Riley slammed her shoulder hard against a metal bulkhead as the pilot yanked the collective, pulling them straight up into the Seattle storm. Her stomach dropped into her shoes. Nausea flared hot and sharp, but she swallowed it down. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not here. Kit! Riley snapped, holding out a hand. Hayes dropped a black canvas roll at her knees. She unzipped it, not bothering with sterile gloves. There was no sterile field here. There was only dirty air, dirty water, and a ticking clock. She snatched a pair of trauma shears and a number 10 scalpel. Coop, when I say go, you pull your hands away. Riley shouted, leaning directly over Miller's face. She could hear the wet, horrific gurgle deep in his throat. He was suffocating on his own blood. If I let go, he bleeds out. Coop screamed. If you don't let go, he suffocates in 60 seconds. Riley yelled back. Do it. Coop ripped his hands away. A dark geyser of venous blood immediately flooded the hollow of Miller's throat, obscuring everything. The anatomy was completely lost. It was just a dark, pooling lake of red. Riley didn't hesitate. She plunged her bare index and middle fingers directly into the open, ragged wound in Miller's neck. It was hot, wet, disgusting. She felt the slick, rubbery pulse of the intact carotid artery against the back of her knuckles. She bypassed it, digging deeper into the ruined meat of his throat, searching by pure touch. The helicopter banked hard, throwing her weight sideways. She dug her knees harder into the deck, ignoring the bruising pain. "Where are you, you bastard?" She thought her teeth grinding together. Her fingertips found it. The jagged, crushed edge of the tracheal ring. It was collapsed inward, acting as a one-way valve, letting blood in but keeping air out. "Suction," she barked. Hayes jammed a portable, battery-operated suction catheter into the wound. It slayed the lake of blood just enough for Riley to see the pale, cartilaginous rings of the windpipe. "Give me an ET tube, size 6, small." Coop slapped the curved plastic tubing into her palm. Riley took a breath. Her hands, usually steady as stone, betrayed a microscopic tremor. She hated herself for it. She hated Gable for getting in her head. She hated Hayes for dragging her back into this nightmare. Most of all, she hated the fact that she knew exactly how to do this. She used the scalpel to blindly widen the hole in the trachea, feeling the blade scrape against cartilage. She dropped the knife onto the bloody deck, grabbed the ET tube, and shoved it directly into the hole she had just made, bypassing the mouth and shattered upper airway entirely. "Bag him." Coop attached the bag valve mask to the end of the tube and squeezed. A wet, horrible hiss of escaping air echoed in the cabin, followed by the miraculous, beautiful sight of Miller's chest rising. "Airway secure!" Coop yelled, tears mixing with the rain on his face. "He's still bleeding!" Riley shouted. She snatched a pair of curved Kelly forceps from the kit. The pool of blood in the neck was filling again. She couldn't see the torn vein. She couldn't see anything. She closed her eyes. Sight was useless here. She plunged the cold metal forceps into the hot, pulsing wound. She felt the tip slide past the muscle fascia, searching for the spongy, retracted end of the jugular. She clamped down blindly. The resistance felt wrong. Too hard. Muscle. She opened the clamp, repositioned a fraction of an inch, and bit down again. This time she felt the unmistakable soft yield of vascular tissue. She locked the forceps shut with a sharp click. She opened her eyes. The dark well of blood in Miller's neck stopped rising. Riley sat back on her heels. The sudden release of tension hit her like a physical blow. Her lungs burned. She realized she hadn't taken a proper breath in 3 minutes. Her arms felt like they were made of lead, and her hands were painted a thick, glossy crimson. "Vitals," she croaked, wiping her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a smear of blood across her brow. "Heart rate is 130. O2 sats climbing. 88, 90. Coop was laughing a hysterical, breathless sound. "He's stable. You got it, boss. You got it." Riley looked down at Miller. His chest was rising and falling in an artificial mechanical rhythm. He looked terrible. He looked half dead. But he was alive. She leaned over and vomited a mixture of stale coffee and stomach acid onto the diamond plate floor. The Black Hawk leveled out the pitch of the engines, dropping into a steady, vibrating drone. Riley sat slumped against the aluminum wall of the cabin, staring at nothing. The adrenaline crash was brutal. It left her cold, shivering, and hollowed out. Her scrubs were ruined. Her cheap clogs were soaked through. She smelled like a butcher shop. Hayes unclipped from his jump seat and crouched beside her. He didn't say anything at first. He just unhooked a green plastic canteen from his webbing, unscrewed the cap, and handed it to her. Riley took it with trembling hands. The water tasted heavily of warm plastic and chlorine, but it was the best thing she had ever drank. She swished it around to kill the taste of bile and swallowed hard. "Thanks," she rasped. Hayes handed her a noise-cancelling headset. She slipped it over her ears. The deafening roar of the helicopter instantly vanished, replaced by a soft hiss of static and the quiet clicking of the intercom. "You did good, Mercer." Hayes's voice crackled in her ear. It wasn't praise, it was just a statement of fact. Riley rested the back of her head against the cold metal bulkhead. "He needs a vascular surgeon. I just bought you an hour, Hayes. If that clamp slips, he bleeds out in 2 minutes. We're 10 minutes out from Lewis McCord. They have a surgical team waiting on the tarmac. He's going to make it." Hayes paused, his grey eyes studying her face in the red light. "You look like garbage, Riley." "I was working a 12-hour shift, Hayes. What's your excuse?" Hayes chuckled a low, rasping sound. "My excuse is I get shot at for a living. What the hell were you doing in that civilian meat grinder anyway, dealing with prima donna doctors who throw tantrums over muddy boots?" Riley looked down at her hands. The blood was drying. It flaked off the webbing of her fingers like rust. "It was quiet." She lied. Her voice sounded thin over the headset. "Nobody asked me to do miracles. Nobody died because I made a bad call under fire. I just handed people bandages and wiped down beds. It was supposed to be easy." "Did it look easy back there in the hallway?" Hayes asked gently. "Because you looked like a caged animal waiting for someone to unlatch the door." Riley closed her eyes. She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him he was an arrogant, war-mongering bastard who didn't understand trauma. But the words died in her throat. Because he was right. Back in the hospital, listening to Dr. Gable berate her, she had felt nothing but a dull, suffocating numbness. But down here, kneeling in a puddle of blood, plunging her hands into a dying man's throat, while a helicopter pitched through the sky, she felt alive. The clarity of the chaos was terrifying. It was a drug, and she was an addict who had just broken a 3-year sobriety streak. "I can't go back there," she whispered, the realization settling heavy in her chest. "I know," Hayes said. "Gable probably already called the Temp agency. You're blacklisted in King County by morning." "It's not about Gable." Riley snapped, opening her eyes. "It's about me. I don't fit in the clean rooms anymore, Hayes. The lights are too bright. The stakes are too low. But I hate this. I hate the smell of it. I hate that I'm good at it." Hayes nodded slowly. He reached out and tapped the subdued medical patch he had slapped onto her chest back in the hospital hallway. It was smeared with Miller's blood now. "You don't have to love it, Riley. You just have to do it," Hayes said quietly. "Miller's alive because you have dirty hands. The world is full of clean, arrogant men like Gable. But when the wheels fall off, they stand frozen in the hallway. We need people who know how to work in the mud." Riley looked across the cabin. Coop was monitoring Miller's vitals, adjusting the IV drip. He looked up, caught Riley's eye, and gave a small, exhausted nod of reverence. She looked back at Hayes. "I'm not enlisting again. I'm not wearing the uniform. I didn't ask you to," Hayes said, leaning back against the fuselage. "I work for a different alphabet soup now. We don't wear uniforms. We don't exist. And we need a chief medical officer who isn't afraid to tell a Tier 1 operator to shut up and hold pressure." The helicopter banked, beginning its descent. Through the rain-streaked window, Riley could see the sprawling runway lights of Joint Base Lewis McCord cutting through the dark. She was exhausted. Her bones ached. Her hands were permanently stained. She was a broken thing pieced back together with scar tissue and dark humor. She unvelcroed the bloody patch from her chest, turning it over in her stained fingers. It felt heavy. It felt like a chain, but it also felt like an anchor. "I want double my captain's pay," Riley said, her voice entirely flat. "And I want my own medical budget. No red tape." Hayes smiled. It was a terrifying, genuine expression. "Done. Welcome back to the dark dock." Riley didn't smile back. She just clipped the radio headset to the wall and reached for a fresh pair of trauma shears. The bird was landing. The wheels were touching down. The sterile world was gone, and she was exactly where she belonged, in the mess. If you loved this story of grit rebellion and finding where you truly belong, even if it's in the dark, hit that like button. Riley's journey from an invisible temp to a battlefield lifesaver is exactly the kind of raw, unapologetic drama we love to write. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss our next visceral, high-stakes original story. Drop a comment below. Would you have walked away or gotten on the chopper? Share this with a friend who appreciates real heroes.